We all take the utmost care of our e-mountain bikes, but there's a few things that you can do, often unintentionally, that can ruin them. Here's a few of those things you definitely don't want to be doing. Most e-mountain bikes will have a charge port built into the frame where you put your charger in to charge your battery. Now, a lot of these will have a plastic cover over there protecting that terminal. Now, it's essential that you close that port after every single charge, because if you go out riding, that port is going to fill with mud and moisture, and it won't even allow you to plug your charger in next time you want to top up your battery. So get it covered. Pressure washing your e-mountain bike is fine if you use your head, or even better, a bike-specific power washer from the likes of Muck-Off. Stay away from directly blasting the motor, the battery, the display and controller. If you are cleaning these parts, just use a damp cloth rather than a direct jet of water. Also keep away from other parts such as fork seals and bearings too. There's no harm whatsoever in removing the outer motor covers that protect the motor on your e-bike. In fact, it's really good practice to get in there and give it a good scrub. Just make sure all that moisture and water can run away from your motor. It's also a good idea to make sure that the drain hole is doing its job and draining that water away. Whilst you're in there, give it a good clean with some water displacer and some corrosion protection on those electrical contacts too. The suspension on your e-mountain bike is very expensive, and you definitely need to keep an eye on things such as the seals and the stanchions and any odd noises that are coming from it, either from the fork or the rear shock. If you don't keep an eye on these things, it could mean that you need to replace the whole unit rather than getting a simple service done on your fork or your rear shock. All suspension requires servicing periodically, dependent on use. Seals need replacing and oil needs changing to get the most from it. It is not a fit and forget item. The cost of this varies, and there are lots of independent businesses out there that will service your suspension. If you're riding in the winter mud without a mud guard, then you're definitely wrecking your bike and wrecking yourself way more than needed. A front mud guard is going to protect you from all the mud that's flying up off your wheels. It's also going to protect your fork seals, and it's going to protect that lower headset cup and the entire part of the front of your bike from all that mud that's going to be spraying off of the front wheel. Now, a rear mud guard is also a great idea too. That's going to protect the rear shock, the rear linkage bearings and your dropper seat post. Get your mud guards on and stay protected. Tyres, they're super expensive, there's no getting away from that. A tyre like this is going to be great if you're riding a trail centre or smashing downhill runs at your local bike park. But if you're commuting on a tyre like this, it's going to eat your range, it's going to roll really slowly and it's going to wear super quick. So if you're commuting on your e-bike, you need to keep your fresh rubber for the trails and swap out something a little bit more skinnier and a little bit more harder compound. That way it's going to make that commute way easy. Save this nice sticky fresh rubber for the trails. It's a really great idea to give your bike a quick check over before going out for a ride, and we like to call this the M check. We start at the back wheel, up to the saddle, down to the cranks, headset, and then down to the front wheel, hence that capital M shape. So first up, just check your tyre pressures, give your derailleur a quick wobble just to make sure that's nice and tight. Whilst you're down there, just check that your rear axle is nice and tight too. Inspect your brake pads, your brake rotor, make sure they're all nice and tight and got plenty of meat on those brake pads. Coming up to the saddle, just check those saddle bolts are nice and tight and there's no gunk built up around your dropper. Work your way down to the cranks, make sure your crank bolts are tight, including those crank preload bolts on the side of the crank. Pedals, make sure they're nice and tight, and of course your chainring bolts and your motor bolts on the frame. Also check that shock shaft to make sure there's no leaking or any damage going on that shaft. Then just pull your front brake and give your headset a quick rock as well. Push the bike back and forward, just make sure there's no movement in there. Quick run round on the bars with an Allen key, just make sure your controls are all nice and tight. Again, down to the front wheel, just check those fork stanchions aren't leaking or any damage on those. Front tyre pressures, give your wheels a wobble just to check bearings. Then just work your way down to that front wheel axle to make sure your wheel is nice and secure. A simple check over like this can annihilate any of those problems that can potentially occur and cause you big expense. Say for instance, if you had a loose derailleur and that goes into the back wheel, it could snap your rear mech off, damage your spokes, and definitely end your day out. Now, the electrical components on your e-bike rely on a good connection to make all the components work together. Now, one part that's often overlooked is going to be the battery that powers the motor on your e-bike. Particularly if you don't remove it too much, it can get quite corroded, particularly in those seals that connect it to the bike. Now, it's really good practice to whip the battery out and apply some dielectric grease into those connections to make sure it's working really well and got the best connection possible. And whilst you're there, it's also a good idea to get into that bolt or the key that holds that battery securely into your frame and give that a little bit of lubrication too. We all make sure our bikes are spanking clean after a big day out there in the hills, but do you make sure that the bike is actually dry before you put it away? If you don't get all the water off of it and out of all the electrical components, then you're asking for trouble from corrosion. Get in the habit of spraying water displacer around the electrical components on your bike to drive any water out and give it a protective layer too. Now, your chain is the most important thing to be looking after on your e-mountain bike. A couple of things here is that you want to make sure that your chain is nice and dry and clean before applying any chain lube to it. If you apply chain lube to a wet chain, you're simply going to trap all that moisture into your chain and it's going to accelerate that chain wear even quicker. And talking of chain wear, an important tool to have in your toolbox when you're riding e-mountain bikes is a chain checker. Now, this is going to measure the wear of your chain. Now, a chain is a lot cheaper to replace than the chain, the cassette, and the front chain ring. If you keep an eye on your chain wear, you need to keep those maintenance costs a lot cheaper. Now, the brakes on your e-mountain bike have a really hard time, particularly on the rear. It's quite common for those pads to wear down super fast. Now, a couple of warning signs could be that your brake lever travel has increased, meaning that your brake lever is coming closer to the handlebars, or maybe the brake isn't as powerful as it once was. Now, it's a good idea to take a look down into that brake caliper to visually inspect how much material you've got left on those brake pads. If you let this wear too low, it could be that the pad material comes off and you're left with just the metal in the brake pads. And obviously metal, breaking on a metal brake rotor isn't good, meaning that when it comes to replacement, you're gonna have to replace your brake rotor as well as those brake pads. Think about where you're using that spray lube. It's quite easy with a spray lube to get carried away and start lubing those areas that you shouldn't really be applying lube to. All it's going to do is attract dirt and dust to those areas that it might not necessarily have gotten into before. And in bad weather, lube can definitely travel on your bike. Say for instance, if you spray some lube on your fork stanchion, when it rains, that lube could run down the fork leg and go onto that front brake, meaning that you've got a contaminated front brake. Just go careful where you use that lube. So there we are, a few ways that you could be destroying your e-bike without even knowing it. But as always, get involved down in the comments below. Let us know if there's any way you've destroyed your e-bike without knowing about it. Give us a thumbs up if you've enjoyed today's video. Make sure you subscribe to us here on EMBN and give us a find and a follow on social media too. Cheers for watching.